Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as usual by my waffling co-host, Tucker Hazel, and we're here today.
I haven't had breakfast yet.
That's true. I did make him a waffle yesterday.
Yeah, I didn't eat it. It's still in the fridge, actually.
Well, now you can have waffle.
I can waffle!
You can waffle
Yes!
later.
Yes!
But we're here to waffle together.
Yeah.
About Zelda and about Nintendo at large, because Echoes of Wisdom...
Nintendo writ large.
I like that.
I've actually never used that in a sentence before.
I don't think I have either. Echoes of Wisdom is coming out in just over a month now, which is very exciting. As we've been learning more and more about the game, it's becoming more and more clear that it is not on, like, almost just an objective level, the return to the 2D Zelda formula that we thought that it might be.
Sure.
And so we just want to sit down and talk about this idea as it relates to Echoes of Wisdom, but then on a larger level, as it relates to Nintendo's franchises, their formulas, and how those formulas change and don't change, and critically what that sort of means to us as fans and as players. Yeah. I think sort of the first place to start, Tucker, because we've not actually really talked about Echoes of Wisdom that
No, yeah, because I was out of town when the second trailer came out.
True.
And so I don't like talking to you when I can't see your face.
And I think I was wearing this shirt in the video I made
Wow,
for it, but
what a connection.
Just so you know,
He has been wearing it the whole time.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. What are you thinking about Echoes of Wisdom?
I'm thinking, and I actually had a conversation with Bo about this game, mostly because we both watched your video and thought you were an annoying, cringy boomer about the Zelda formula.
Did you really?
Yes.
Okay.
And in that, when I'm looking at Echoes of Wisdom and the ways in which it is becoming the 2D version of 3D Zelda, and I think kind of an interesting way, I'm interested in your thoughts on this, the opposite of the ways in which Breath of the Wild was taking inspiration from Zelda 1, so like sort of the freedom of Zelda 1 being put into an open world format for 3D Zelda. I find the balance between the two something very, very compelling. And for Echoes of Wisdom, in the freedom it allows for traversal and puzzle solving and the unique mechanics that it seems to be introducing with the fact that they're implementing things like Ultra Hand and cooking back into 2D formula. I think that there is a very slim chance that this is not my favorite 2D Zelda.
Sure.
Because I just think that step forward for 2D Zelda, a sub-franchise of a major franchise that hasn't been touched in a decade, bare minimum, but even longer than that for something that was completely from the ground up new, I think that this change is very necessary for that sub-series, which I enjoy. I like Link to the Past a lot. I love Minish Cap. I love Link Between Worlds. But those games ultimately do end up feeling kind of samey, and there still are a bunch of 2D Zeldas I have not touched. And so looking to where Zelda was able to reinvent in the Switch generation, I think the Zelda team realizes it is that reinvention that catapulted them to greater and greater success sales numbers. I believe Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild are like 65% the two titles of the entire pool of Zelda sales combined. And I think that it's important for them to take what their learnings and apply them, and where that lands on a scale of how satisfying that is for the game design of 2D versus if you were wanting, as we'll talk about, this series to return to where its roots more traditionally were. I think that's the conversation we're having today. But for me, the willingness in the Zelda team to, from the ground up, reinvent 2D Zelda by reincorporating what has now popularized the series, frankly, I think shows the willingness that we'll get into in this larger video about how Nintendo is willing to make those reinventions, even when maybe the community doesn't initially want those or isn't asking for those things. I don't think anyone's asking for a 2D version of Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and that's what we got. But that I think is what makes Nintendo so special, is the willingness to deliver something that we actually aren't asking for.
Yeah, I mean, my point in that Zelda video was not that I'm not excited for Echoes of Wisdom by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
I think that the game looks really great, and I said so in that video. My point was that I think there's a larger, interesting context around this game that 2D and 3D Zelda prior to Breath of the Wild never existed within. In reality, when you're looking at Minish Cap next to Wind Waker, the formula is ostensibly the same.
Yeah, yeah,
There are
definitely.
differences between 2D Zelda and 3D Zelda inherently in terms of combat and how puzzles
Yeah,
can be
yeah.
designed because they're literally
An extra
using
dimension.
different axes. But in reality, the format of those was pretty similar.
Yeah, definitely.
When you're looking at
Dungeon progression, puzzle progression, item progression.
yes,
A lot more similar in that time period is what you're saying, versus Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom eschewed the traditional dungeon structure,
100%.
the traditional item structure, things like that. That you're right. The divide actually isn't 2D Zelda and 3D Zelda. It's really pre-Breath of the Wild and post-Breath of the Wild.
yeah, and I mean when you're looking at Breath of the Wild into Link's Awakening, I
Yeah.
thought part of the fun of Link's Awakening for me
Sure.
was that it really was a counterpoint to Breath of the Wild.
Yeah,
not
definitely.
because I needed a counterpoint because I dislike Breath of the Wild because that's
course.
one of my top probably 15 games ever.
Absolutely.
It's more so just that it sort of illustrated the point of the 2D Zelda formula, which is to say there is there is a real different appeal to those games than
Absolutely.
the Breath of the Wild type games.
Yeah.
And so when we've been asking for that new 2D Zelda, because as you were saying, it's been since A Link Between Worlds, and
Yeah.
I would contest that even though it's reusing map, it is so
Of course.
markedly different that that is
yeah,
its
yeah.
own experience. You know, it's been a decade plus since we got that game.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Link's Awakening is a remake. So when we see Echoes of Wisdom, and Echoes of Wisdom is not a return to item-based progression.
Yeah.
It's not a return to sort of curated puzzles. It is the sort of repurposing. I mean that just as in a neutral
of
way. The
course.
repurposing of this new open air
Yeah,
format
yeah.
for 2D. I think to myself, well, in some ways, I find this to be a missed opportunity in that I think that there is still more you can do with this
Sure.
2D Zelda formula
Yeah.
as we knew it, and sort of crossing the streams, as it were, between 3D Zelda and 2D Zelda. To me, sort of, it doesn't flatten the possibilities
Yeah.
because there's, I think, as we're going to discover in Echoes of Wisdom, there's going to be so much new to experience.
Yeah.
But I think that we're going to inherently rely on the same types of puzzle solving tropes
Sure,
and ideas
sure.
in that game that we did in
Yeah.
3D. And we're even seeing that with the fact that Bond is ostensibly Ultra Hand.
Definitely is, yes.
Echo is a brand new mechanic for
Yeah.
sure, but a lot of what we were seeing there is just the same building blocks
Yeah,
of
totally.
3D and 2D.
Yeah.
So my whole
Well, I mean,
contention...
in an interesting way, I think you could also say, like, the building and placing of things is also probably inspired by the building mechanics of Tears of the
100%.
Kingdom that also come from Ultra Hand. Ultra Hand is like 4 different things in
Yeah.
one, so then you can take those aspects and actually apply them to most of the mechanics there in Echoes
Yeah.
of Wisdom, because there's like sort of the Magnesis style, Ultra Hand style thing, and there's also like the sticking things together kind of
Yeah.
thing. I'm like, well, that's also Ultra Hand.
Yeah, and so that's why it's not that I'm disappointed by Echoes of Wisdom
Yeah,
in
of
any
course.
way, but it's more that I think there was now more than ever in the past a place for 2D Zelda
Sure.
that is arguably still not going to be filled by Echoes of Wisdom.
I think you're right with that. Absolutely. I think what's interesting about the fact that we've kind of nailed down that the dichotomy between 2D Zelda and 3D Zelda pre-Breath of the Wild was actually not that massive a gap.
Yeah.
And we've actually returned to that in some way, in that now the gap between 2D Zelda and 3D Zelda isn't that massive of a gap because now they're similar in
Yeah.
this way. The Zelda ground foundation seems to have been shifted to where now both streams of Zelda are built on that new foundation rather than the foundation before. Whereas I think what you were hoping for and think there is still space for is there to be current games being built on the multiple foundations.
Which is not a quality judgment.
course.
It's more of a like a catalog balancing judgment
Sure.
because there obviously we've seen in the sales disparity of the new Zelda games
Yeah.
and then Skyward Sword HD
Yeah.
that there is a vast preference for this style of Zelda. Although Skyward Sword HD is also, it had an uphill battle. It was a remake.
Yeah.
There, it didn't have the same pomp and circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, that game really barely sold better than it did on Wii.
Yeah,
Right.
which is interesting.
So
And it notoriously did not sell very well on Wii.
no. And in most people's minds, its sales figures on Wii, which were about 3 million, were more than anything due to the fact that the Wii was ostensibly a dead platform by
yeah.
holiday 2011,
Yep.
but Switch in 2021 absolutely was not.
no.
So there was a deeper,
Yeah.
something deeper there to Skyward Sword.
Yeah.
But I think the thing of it for me is that there is still real creative energy in that in that formula.
Sure.
And I just was hoping to see that again, especially just because to look historically, as we've been saying, when Nintendo is operating on handheld and home console,
Yeah.
you actually didn't really have a major difference between series. Like if you're thinking about Mario Kart on
Yeah.
DS and Mario Kart Wii are not that different.
yeah.
Animal Crossing on
Wild
DS
World
and Wii were
yeah.
even less different,
Yes,
right? Essentially,
What about New Soup DS, New Soup Wii?
I mean, a lot of what Nintendo was doing was not really actually having disparate formulas for handheld
Yeah.
and home console. Now, different saving structures, game structures, various
Yeah.
things to an extent, but in an era right now where Nintendo is, I think, updating its franchise formulas more than ever in Animal Crossing,
Yeah.
in Zelda, as we've been saying,
Even technically in 3D Mario versus what
Yeah.
3D Mario was between 2007 and 2017.
Yeah, I think that there's actually more space now than ever
Yeah.
to have older formulas exist in tandem with new formulas
Sure.
in a way that I would actually contend was never really the case in the
No.
past for most series.
That's definitely true, and I think that what's interesting is we're going to be nailing in on the ways in which each of Nintendo's series, or some of Nintendo's series, we're not talking about everything, have evolved over time, but actually quite a bit of the reinvention of these series came within the last 7-8 years with the Switch. And so what you're pointing in on, I think, as we drilled in on for Zelda, but this is actually technically emblematic of many series, is that they moved the foundation rather than creating a plethora of
100%.
foundations. In that, I agree there is now the space for this, where there was the potential for there to be space before, but they almost didn't really seem to care about that, even when they had multiple platforms. We talk about a lot of these multiple mainline entries from their biggest series. They're actually surprisingly similar to each other, and not in the way that... And honestly, Breath of the Wild and Link's Awakening, having both of those in the same system, is probably the biggest disparity in design intent between two mainline entries
100%.
on one system ever in the history of Nintendo. And even within the same era, you look at something like 3D World and 3D Land.
100%.
Those are the two. I'd say even more so than Galaxy and Galaxy 2. I think 3D Land and 3D World are the two most similar 3D Mario games, even though they're on totally different platforms.
Yeah.
And it showed, I think it shows that Nintendo, in their willingness to reinvent, they in some ways still they are almost too willing to then maybe reject what has come before. And I think that maybe in the financial decisions that goes into what kind of game are we going to be making next, I think for them it is less a variety thing that maybe that you and I would want out of. We want two Zelda games that are vastly different.
Yeah.
But it is more that we see that people really, really want these elements in the games. From zeroing back on Zelda, the freedom of Breath of the Wild, the multiple, open air format, the multiple solutions to puzzles and things.
Yeah.
Those are, I think, a big part of the reason why Breath of the Wild is the biggest game of the Zelda formula. And they're like, well, we know that people want this, and let's capitalize on that now, even if it means, quote unquote, sacrificing what has come before to reinvent 2D Zelda. I think Aonuma and the team and Nintendo's decisions are like, well, we want this to have the greatest opportunity to sell 10 million copies. And I think it's possible it does. I'm not positive that that'll happen.
I'm not either.
But I think it is more likely that Echoes of the Wisdom, taking inspiration and having very clear UI elements from Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, is more likely to sell more with a wider audience that clearly that style appeals to than Link's Awakening was, which came out early in the Switch's life cycle and has had years and years to sell. I think that Echoes of Wisdom will probably outsell Link's Awakening because I think that this design intent of freedom and that being what Zelda is to a lot of people now appeals to a much wider demographic.
Yeah, I mean, I have reservations about how the game is going to sell, but that's outside of its design, really, frankly. It's
how about this? I think it's intended to sell more.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, let me put a spin on that. To me, its sales result is really just, if anything, going to be emblematic of where the Switch ecosystem is on the whole, more than anything. Mm-hmm. Where I wanted to complicate what you were saying is, I think it is definitely in part true that this is a response to what players are liking. Because
Yeah.
we even got interviews of Ayanuma and Fujibayashi when Tears of the Kingdom was coming out, talking about how they were really intently looking at social media and
Yeah.
various things in the designing phase of Tears of the Kingdom. But I would actually argue that the reason that Echoes of Wisdom is the way that it is because it's the same people working on the game.
Sure.
Which
Oh, sure.
which
Yeah.
seems reductive, but I think Ayanuma has been on record saying that the future of Zelda is Breath of the Wild.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
is
yeah.
Tears of the Kingdom. In reality, he's definitely overseeing that game. Of
course, yeah.
He's setting up that design document. We don't know if Fujibayashi is the director or not. We'll find
doubt
out
it, yeah.
in a couple months. But in reality, as long as EPT3...
Well, I doubt it because he was working on Tears of the Kingdom until last year.
Well, what's interesting is, right, if the game was mostly done in 2022...
Yeah.
There's a chance that this game came together
Yeah.
in late in development. What is it's a different
Late
it's a sidebar.
2021 is probably when this game started development.
Yeah, it's a different. The point for me really is that if EPD3 is setting the pace, then this is what we're gonna get, right?
Sure.
Because
Yeah,
it's
yeah, I
what
see what you're
EPD3
saying.
wants to
Yeah.
make, and that's why. And this is almost a different conversation, but part of the reason that I'm pleased that Nintendo merged handheld and home console
Yeah.
is that I think that they always just march their formulas forward as designers, and then they fit that to the platform, opposed to the platform dictating the design. What I mean to say is look at 3D Land and 3D World again.
Sure.
Those games are very similar.
Yeah.
That, in my opinion, comes from a place of saying this is what we want Mario to be.
Yeah.
Not necessarily this is what Mario should be on Wii U.
Oh, sure. I see what you're saying.
And I think, I think you can project that backwards too. Like I said, Animal Crossing is a critical example. You
Yeah.
can just simply import your save data from Wild World into City Folk, and be off for the races,
Yeah.
right? There's always been
Which is a very interesting thing for us to learn about. Or is
Yeah.
like, how does that work? Why does that work?
100%.
Because I think from our retrospective point
Yeah.
of view, we're like, oh, every new Animal Crossing, every new whatever is so different where it doesn't make any sense that you can transfer saves. But was a time when Nintendo was splitting its resources so much that
Yeah.
in order to be able to support multiple platforms, design decisions were made to reuse assets, reuse engines, reuse design formulas to create multiple titles that if you're not paying attention you won't realize are actually very similar, but
Yeah.
in reality it's smart dev and smart use of assets to be able to create multiple games from the same groundwork that they spent years iterating on an engine and a design doc and things like that,
Yeah.
which is how we get multiple new Super Mario Brothers games and multiple Animal Crossing games within the same period and 3D Marios and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, Animal Crossing. There's four versions of the first game. N64, two different versions on disc in Japanese, on GameCube, one US disc.
Okay.
Those
So
are
those are four.
Those are four of essentially the same game. Which,
I'll need to look into those Japanese ones. I know nothing about that.
yeah,
Very interesting.
Essentially, the English very small.
Yeah.
The English version on GameCube is a translated version of Daibutsu Nomura E+. But then before that, there's Daibutsu Nomura on GameCube, and then there's Daibutsu Nomura Animal Forest on N64.
Sure.
The point is, all of those are basically the same game.
Yeah.
There's not a big difference from that to Wild World, and there's a smaller difference from Wild World to
City Folk.
City Folk.
Yeah.
Nintendo historically works in that way.
Yeah.
Even if you go all the way back to Game Boy era,
Mm-hmm.
if you think about Super Mario Land 2, 6 Golden Coins, that game is really not far away from Super Mario World.
Mm-hmm.
When you're thinking about the fact that it has this overworld map, the sprites are similar, the
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
mechanics are similar, obviously different power-ups, different theming, but those come from the same tree.
Sure. Yeah.
I think you can look back across history and you can see where concessions have been made for hardware.
Sure.
Metroid 2 is a very linear game, but Metroid 2, is certainly not a massive
Yeah,
far
definitely.
cry away from other
same with
Metroids,
Link's
even though it's
Awakening.
more linear. Link's Awakening is another great example.
yeah.
Link's Awakening came from initially a desire to port
Yeah.
Link to the Past to Game Boy. Instead, it became its own title.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of my overarching points I wanted to make in this video is that people like myself who sort of lament the loss of that 2D Zelda
Sure.
formula should think about the past and realize that in reality, even when Nintendo's platforms were split,
Yeah.
their design direction was sort of unified them.
Yeah, sure.
But with that said, I think that we're in
It
a
doesn't
different...
need to be necessary anymore.
Right, because we're
I
in
see
a
what you're
different
saying.
era
Yeah,
of
definitely.
Nintendo now, where I think that there should be space for multiple types of these games.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of current 3D Mario. When you look at Odyssey,
Yeah.
Odyssey is in some ways a return to 64 in Sunshine, but in
Yeah.
other ways it is an evolution of even that formula. It's much, much, much more open than those
course,
games ever
yeah,
were.
yeah.
Then when we got 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, obviously the 3D World parts of the port, but what's the new thing they built?
Yeah.
They built something
Even more open.
even more open
Yeah.
than Odyssey, right?
Yeah.
So that's the direction they're moving forward.
Yeah, it seems. Yeah, of course.
You know, people...
Well, what's also interesting
Yeah.
about the way that ports have been leveraged,
Yeah.
And remakes have been leveraged on Switch, is it really is in the world of ports and remakes that Switch has the most variety in any given series on
This is a great
of
point.
Nintendo's history, because you are able to play more traditional 2D Mario, linear 2D Mario in 3D World. You're able to play more open 3D Mario in Odyssey,
Yeah.
and you're able to play really open 3D Mario in Bowser's Fury.
a great
Same with Zelda. We have 2 open air games. We have a straightforward traditional 2D Zelda. We have a straightforward traditional 3D Zelda, and now we're having a open air 2D Zelda. It's even true for 2D Mario. There's a port of a more traditional 2D Mario game. There's the total reinvention 2D Mario in Wonder, and then there's a Maker game. And there's 3D Kirby and 2D Kirby. There's traditional Pokemon in BDSP, and there's open world Pokemon. I think they actually do realize that there is a hunger for traditional Pokemon, for 2D Kirby, for
Yeah.
2D Zelda, for linear 3D Mario, for straight up 2D Mario. And that isn't the reinvention of all these things, because there is nostalgia for that, and a lot of these games have sold really, really well. And
Yeah.
so I think my olive branch extended to you is I don't think Nintendo has abandoned that.
That's a great point.
I think that there's a very strong possibility that we're just getting to the point where these series will then maybe oscillate back and forth once more entries have come out, because we're still relatively young in the reinvention of all of these formulas. We've only gotten one Wonder style game. We've only gotten one. I mean, Bowser's Fury is its own thing.
One New Horizons style game.
Yeah, and Horizon.
New Horizons.
Animal Crossing.
Only
I see
one
what you're
of its new
saying.
Animal
Yeah.
Crossing.
And so there is the possibility that they're able to create a. I mean, I think Hal's probably making a 2D Kirby, and so then that will be satiated. I think that there's a chance that we get a more traditional Zelda in another 3D remake. Obviously, there's a potential of re-releases of Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, which would then satiate that. But I think the shaky ground then becomes: is it enough to satiate the lust, hunger for the traditional formulas of these series by just doing remakes and re-releases, which they've been doing a lot of? And so there is content in those great games in all of those veins available on Switch, but they are not the new games. And I think that might be where you're like, man, I wish they were able to make new games in these more traditional styles.
Right.
Now that they've completely abandoned these more traditional styles of design.
That's actually a really, really, really strong point. And this is another thing that I think, as a community, we still need to really evaluate.
Sure.
Which is the role of remakes and remasters in Nintendo's catalog now and moving forward.
Yeah.
Because if you look historically, Nintendo's remakes were very sparse until about 2011. Because then by 2011, 2 of the tentpole games for 3DS that year were Ocarina of Time 3D and Star Fox 64 3D. And then we obviously get Majora's Mask, we get Wind Waker, we get Twilight Princess. You know, we're seeing, obviously, Pokemon's been a long-standing player in the remake space. And there's been other remakes from Nintendo in the past, but by and large, if you look at the concentration of them, it's only gotten more and more and more over the past, I would say, 10 years, 12 years, 13 years or something.
I mean, how many remakes were on Wii U? Like 1, 2? I can't even think of it off the top of my head.
Yeah,
there were actually a lot of them on 3DS, and then there are even more on Switch, obviously.
Exactly. And so that is a good point, 100%, because that is a way for Nintendo to intrinsically sort of, I don't know, it's sort of represent, I guess, the old formula.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
they're really not...
Nintendo, you already showed this in class 6 times.
and this is actually an interesting case for a game like Link's Awakening not being a more radical remake.
Definitely. I see what you're saying, yeah.
Because while people might have been lamenting its grid structure
Yeah.
or lamenting various things, in reality, its sort of preservation of that style
Yeah.
of Zelda actually makes it more distinct.
Definitely. Absolutely true.
Particularly as time has gone on now.
Yeah.
So I think that you make an interesting point for the fact that we need to look to the past in a literal sense
Yeah,
for these formulas, because I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with what you think about me. I think that an Ocarina of Time remake, for as much as I bitch about that idea,
Yeah.
would satisfy my hunger for this old Zelda format,
Sure.
because I think that there's 0% chance that we get another Zelda game like that that's new.
I see what you're saying, like a new
New Ocarina of Time style
dungeons
Zelda game.
and items and stuff. I think that, or at least I think it'd take a while.
If it does
Yeah.
come back, I think it would circle back around in the Odyssey way, which is
Yeah.
to say it's back, but it's expanded upon.
Definitely. Yeah.
But you make a
Yeah.
good
Well,
point.
I think it's possible that that might happen when Aonuma is no longer involved, because it seems like
Yeah.
he, as not the director, but he seems to be the primary directional creative force of the mainline Zelda series. That his and Fujibayashi's drive to do the kinds of games that they have been is what is really clearly shaping the direction.
Well-
I mean, it'll take a change in leadership to then shift things backwards.
It's interesting because I believe, and let me just do a quick Google search here. I believe that Fujibayashi was the director on Phantom Hourglass.
He directed a lot of games, actually. Yeah. I think he even did Minish Cap. I think he goes back even farther than that, is what I'm saying.
But the reason that I raise this in particular, Phantom Hourglass, Moby Games. Moby Games may be the best resource for gaming knowledge that exists on the internet right now.
Yeah, well, what about Backlog Banter?
Yeah, it's tough. Okay, so I was a little wrong. Daiki Iwamoto, who is obviously very influential in EPD3
Yeah.
right now, directed that game, but the sub-director was Fujibayashi.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I raise this is because, Miyamoto directed Zelda games for a
Yeah.
long time. He and Aonuma were sort of the creative thrust for the series.
Yeah.
In the early
Yeah.
days, back in the R&D structure and
Mm-hmm.
various things. What we actually might be seeing is that it's the younger talent, or the talent, because these guys aren't young,
No.
but they have these really pivotal roles.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe they are actually just saying, we don't want to make Ocarina of Time style games
Sure,
anymore.
yeah.
Our influence is pushing Zelda in this direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what is interesting about the structure of modern Nintendo and
Yeah.
the teams that they work with is that it doesn't really seem to be the core EPD teams that are the ones that are willing to make the return to formulas.
Yeah.
Because it is outsourcing to external development that allows us to get any form of a traditional 2D Zelda, traditional 2D Mario, traditional whatever, traditional Pokemon even.
Yeah.
In that you're teaming up with Tantalus, you're teaming up with Forever, you're teaming up with those fucking hacks that made BSP. You're so outsourcing to
Yes.
these external teams, and even technically, even with like Grezzo making remakes. Grezzo made Link's Awakening, and now even Grezzo has been around. What's interesting is it seems like the longer a Nintendo team is around,
Yeah.
the more likely they are to reinvent the formula. And I think this is a perfect point to shift to the landscape and the wider history of Nintendo reinventing their formulas. Nintendo, we talked a mean game about how about your point about design influencing the. Well, okay, hold on. What were you saying? The design influencing the core of the games, not the hardware, or something like that.
The people are choosing what the game should be, not the hardware.
Yeah.
The example I give is like if you look at Wind Waker and Minish Cap.
Yeah.
Obviously, those games are very different in scale, and intrinsically, that's in part because GameCube, we want to build this big, impressive, great
Yeah.
C. You obviously can't do that in GBA. But if you are to look at the component elements of these games, finding a couple items.
Yeah.
To solve dungeons,
Yeah.
plot twists, more dungeons to solve, Ganon to fight.
Yeah.
Right? This formula is the same in both places. And maybe something like Metroid 2 is not a great example because it has a different objective than like
Yeah.
a Super Metroid and hunting down the Metroids. But for the most part, I think you can look at a lot of Nintendo's franchises throughout time and say, okay, these handheld and home console entries might be different in ambition, in scale simply because it's impossible to duplicate
yeah.
the scale on the handheld. But for the most part, they're driven by the same objectives.
Yeah.
Even if you look at the Zelda games on DS, those and Skyward Sword really are not far apart in that the objective there was to craft puzzles around hardware gimmicks.
Oh, interesting. I see what you're saying.
All Skyward Sword is saying, what can the Wii Remote and Motion Plus do? All Spirit Tracks is saying is, what can the touchscreen do? What can the microphone do?
Yeah.
What can rest mode do?
Yeah.
Right? And maybe that's a stretch, but I think the point is where Nintendo's at the time dictates what the games are much more than what the hardware is, and I think more than what the players want even.
Sure. Yeah. And it's interesting in where Nintendo's series have then evolved over time within that. As Miyamoto's not directing games, Aonuma's directing games, okay, then the games take sort of a change, and then Fujibayashi's the one directing games, and so there is this sort of more iterative evolution. And do you think we can make the case that most of Nintendo's franchises have changed the most in the Switch era, or do you think it's not defensible necessarily?
I would say that you could make a case for it 100%.
Sure. Yeah. And then
I think you can. The reason that I think you can make a good case for that being a sort of conscious or like intentional choice. Well, here's what the reason I'm complicating this is like N64. The franchises had to change,
of course,
but that's because we were at an apex, like an inflection point for gaming as a whole, right? On Wii, they had to change to an extent because of motion control, but even within that, a lot of the games you get on Wii are just motion controlled iterations of what came before.
Yeah.
Prime 3 Corruption is a different game than Prime 1 for sure, but not by an extent to which you'd say that they reinvented Prime.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, of course.
I think in the Switch era, they have done the most to really unprompted dig up the foundations.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, and actually, this is something we've had conversations with in the past, in that even though the Switch, in a certain way, has many, many gimmicks, they aren't as integral to requiring them to
100%.
to design a game around it, to where I think that you're right. It seems like in the Switch era, these reinventions have come from a higher level. We want this to change rather than this needs to change.
Yeah, and this is... I'm going to subtweet Botox Games, but you guys already subtweeted me by having a conversation with my video, so now it's my turn.
You're using the word subtweet in a very loose way now.
I am, but it's, I have to do it. Yeah. Sub-X. Is that better? Sub-Zeet? Bo talks a lot, and this is not just a Bo talking point, but Bo's like one of two Nintendo YouTubers I watch alongside Nintendo Chronicles. Shout out Josh Goldie, who's awesome and I've known for a long time.
You should watch. This is I know you don't really want to.
That's fine. What is it?
The Nintendo Forecaster. Very, very different videos.
I'm not familiar with them.
Nintendo Forecaster makes like Nintendo financial videos. Like he breaks down the history of these devs moved from this team to that team.
That sounds very good.
And the financial history indicates this, and how the fluctuation of the end. This is just a shout out to one of my new favorite channels, Nintendo Forecaster. Great channel.
Are they a small channel? Never heard of them.
I can't remember off the
Sure.
top of my head.
Well, that's totally fine.
No, but they don't have 100 subscribers.
Yeah. Well, I only watch channels above a certain subscriber threshold, so it might be tricky.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of talk about the idea that Nintendo is listening to fans.
Yeah.
And I think that this is true to an extent, but I also think it's important to note that I don't think that Nintendo made Metroid Prime 4 because the fans wanted it.
Yeah.
I think that there's a really good chance that in 2008, there was a lot of people within Nintendo that wanted to make Metroid Prime 4.
Yeah. I think it was likely there were more people there then than there were in 2017 when the game was announced.
The point I'm making is that I think part of Nintendo's flexibility right now to experiment is because they're in a position of strength that they've never been in before.
Yeah.
They've been in various positions of strength in the past, 100%, but they're in a position of strength right now where their cultural ubiquity, their development pipelines, everything is just hitting.
Yeah.
It's never been like this before. And so I think from that is a freedom of creativity that I think was missing from Wii U and 3DS to an extent. Not necessarily because Nintendo said, oh, la 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 la, we're not listening to fans, not listening to fans, not listening to fans, but saying, look, every game we release seems to be a big deal.
Yeah.
Our development pipeline's fucked. We can't take a gamble on something right now. But now that they're gambling, I think that's why we're seeing these bigger changes to formula.
Sure.
In reality, there's no real reason that New Horizons should be what it is.
Yeah.
Right? New Leaf was a big success.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
And if they just released another Animal Crossing game like that,
Yeah.
that was iterative and improved upon the main mechanics and various things, made it a little bit more open or whatever, still would have sold 30 million units probably. It would have been a
maybe.
massive, especially releasing in 2020 still. Like,
But it might not have sold 50 million
yeah,
units.
but again, I think Nintendo now has a sort of safety net to play more.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we're seeing these bigger swings,
Yeah.
which is cool.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, it seems that these bigger swings, even in things that people might not have been asking for, people weren't necessarily asking for a total reinvention of the Zelda formula for Breath of the Wild. People weren't necessarily, as you're suggesting, asking for the total reinvention of the Animal Crossing formula that was established in New Horizons. But that these big swings are paying big dividends, the biggest
100%.
dividends they've ever seen. And I think what is future projecting a little bit, and to the return to the point about Echoes of Wisdom, what may be slightly worrisome for the future is that these might then become the foundations that then aren't deviated from too big. Both are possible futures. We haven't seen the post Tears of the Kingdom 3D Zelda. We haven't seen the next Mario Kart, next 3D Zelda, the next 2D Mario After Wonder. We're still at the building grounds of all this,
Yeah.
but it is possible that in the way that I think that the dungeon and item formula of 2D, 3D Zelda got stale over the course of 15 years of those games and many, many games, or how people notoriously point at 2D Mario for growing stale after a certain time, and Pokemon for going stale after a certain time. I think there's a chance that if we're 15 years from now and we've gotten 3 games that that follow the Wonder formula, and we've gotten 2 or 3 more open air Zelda games, and 3 open world Pokemon games that feel like they're more pulling from Scarlet and Violet than reinventing, that there's a chance that there is this greater hunger even within the dev teams to branch out and maybe branch back to the traditional Mario format, the traditional Pokemon format, the traditional Zelda format, because these are working so well, you can see them being like, okay, well, let's just stick with this, which would be playing it safe in the way that I think part of what made so many of these Switch entries so much bigger than previous entries is because they didn't play it safe, and because they were willing to completely reinvent things. But that just becomes the business and creative balance that is so difficult to straddle of what do people want, what do the devs want to do, what will sell well, what will reinvent things, what do people want versus don't want, and you can never nail that down perfectly.
No.
And it'll be very fascinating to see how from a higher level, if Nintendo then just built on the frameworks that they've established now. And I think that they'll see great success in, and as they did with Tears of the Kingdom, great success but slightly lesser success in making the next New Horizons sequel that is very similar to New Horizons, making the next 3D Mario that is more similar to Odyssey than to 3D World or whatever. That there's a chance that they stick on this path, and then that also then becomes kind of tiresome.
But I think that's a strong point. And I mean, we do see them decide to cycle back. We've seen it in Mario recently, not only with, like I said, cycle back with an extend with Odyssey and with Bowser's Fury.
Yeah.
But also Mario Party, obviously, is a great example of that.
Yeah.
And there's other conversation we had about the ways in which remakes not only return to old formulas, but retraining developers on old ideas to implement in new ways. I think it was the UI designer for Prime 4 was on Twitter recently saying that working on Metroid Prime Remastered gave him a skill set that he was unable to implement in Prime 4 and build upon. So there's a big calculus, I think, to how Nintendo's formulas evolve.
Yeah.
And that's why I complicate the idea that it's that it was ever about handheld versus home console. Why I complicate the idea that right now it's just Nintendo, ear to the ground. What do fans want? Okay, we're gonna make that. I think
it's definitely not that.
I think there's a lot going on. There's changing leadership. Obviously, I mean, how many different presidents has Nintendo gone through now?
Yeah.
When you look back historically, someone like Yamauchi was around for fucking ever.
Yeah.
I mean, the changing of the guard was a lot rarer in the past than it is now. So there's a period of great fluctuation.
Yeah.
There's a period of unprecedented financial success.
Yeah.
There's new people leading these teams. People who've maybe been around for Nintendo for a long time and are not young people, but are newer to their leadership roles.
Sure.
There's a lot that is pushing franchises forward or pushing them left or pushing them right.
Yeah.
But it's not really pushing them backwards. And so I think
I see what you're saying.
I think that we just have to, I think, simply acknowledge as a community that the idea that Echoes of Wisdom was ever going to just be like a Link to the Past style game, as simple as that, was not going to be. As much as I would like that, as much as I think there's a hole for that, I think when we look at Nintendo's history, they've not they've not felt the need to take advantage of these sorts of gaps before. They want to move these franchises in the direction they're going to move them. And it just so happens, I think, that we're in a position right now where the direction they want to move these franchises aligns with players really nicely for the most part.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think you're no doubt right that there could be a point very soon, i.e. 5 years from now, when we're getting the next game in all these series, if it's too similar, then it feels tiring again.
Well, what's interesting as sort of a closing point to this is that I think that there is still enough space within their wider pool of series to still keep things fresh in reinventing series that haven't been reinvented yet. It has been 10 years since the last Mario Kart. Mario Kart 9 might be that next reinvention of the Mario Kart formula. It has been 10 years since the last 2D Donkey Kong. It is possible that the next 2D Donkey Kong is the Wonder.
Actually, I'm positive it's not going to be that.
What?
It's just going to be a port.
Oh, sure. The next new 2D Donkey Kong is something like 2D Metroid has not had the reinvention because Dread was a very solid return to formula of being more traditional in that way. There still are these pockets of their IP stable that never got the Switch reinvention treatment, and so if next generation we're getting the biggest, newest Donkey Kong ever, the biggest, newest Mario Kart ever, the biggest, newest 2D Metroid that is a Robobot to Triple Deluxe, that feels like a reinvention in that way. And within all of these, I think that I think that what we're living through with the Switch is, in my mind, a very good balance, because each of the markets that we were talking about, or each of these desires, is still spoken to in some way. In a way that it is not possible to satiate all of them with new games, because certain Zelda fans want this, certain Zelda fans want that. It's like, okay, so we'll put the effort to where most Zelda fans seem to want, and then we'll give the people who want traditional Zelda what they want in a couple remakes, in re-releases, things like that, dipping into the back catalog. And then that cycle continues and ever rolls forward with these other series. It is very possible that we see the next Star Fox that is not a traditional Star Fox, but is using the bones of shooting and flying around in more of an open format.
Funnily enough, reinventing the Star Fox formula is actually just making a regular game, because the Star Fox formula right now is to do something fucking weird and different every time. But no, you make a really good point.
There still is this space of the next F-Zero, the next Star Fox, the next new IPs and things that totally reinvent things. And so I don't think I think it'll be longer than 5 years to when things start to feel like, okay, we're still just building off of Switch to these were the foundations, because there still are series that haven't been reinvented, Mario Kart being the biggest one, and frankly even like Smash Brothers. Like if Smash gets a reboot because Ultimate can't really be topped, then there will be traditional Smash and like Breath of the Wild style reinvention Smash. I think that's possible.
And this is just where it'll get really interesting to see, because I mean, Mario Kart arguably got its reinvention to an extent with Mario Kart 7 with kart customization and with underwater and gliding and various things. There's a chance they just say, look, Mario Kart is so big and so ubiquitous, we just leave it alone. A game like Dread is really interesting, because Dread, I would argue, is that reinvention, although it is obviously trading in part on ideas from 2 decades ago. The speed of the game, the linearity of the game, the counter mechanics, the action emphasis. My friend Jonathan Holmes referred to it in his review of it as like closer to a Bayonetta type game than the older Metroids. And that was certainly something I was thinking about when playing like Zero Mission. I think another thing that goes under the radar is just the extent to which things do change. even
Sure.
if they look the same on the
Yeah.
surface, right? And I think 2D Metroid's a great example of that. But Metroid's also just an interesting illustration of how Nintendo is very comfortable running two different formulas
Sure.
against each other.
Yeah. We're getting new games in 2D and 3D or Metroid. Yeah.
Yeah, and really, there's no reason to suspect that Mercury Steam is not making Metroid 6 right now.
I think they are, yeah.
And there's a good chance that those games will release within a year of each other.
Yeah.
I mean, Nintendo's released 2 Metroid games on the same day
Welcome
before,
back,
so.
2002.
Yeah, that was 2002. They released Fusion and Prime,
Yeah.
like at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is very interesting. But yeah, I think as we wrap up from our waffle sesh,
Yeah.
yummy. The big takeaways for me really are just it shouldn't be a surprise Echoes of Wisdom is what it is.
Yeah.
And I think you make a good point about us sort of being in almost a new ground zero for a lot of Nintendo franchise formulas. And you raise a really, really good point about the role of remakes.
Yeah.
They're playing a role here that we've not seen before. In diversifying franchises, interestingly.
Yeah.
While you could say, oh, it's just remakes, it's just old stuff padding out a catalog, I think at the same time you can say, well, actually, they're a really critical part of giving different types of experiences on the system.
Yeah.
Thousand Year Door might just be a pretty much one-to-one remake of Thousand Year Door, but it's suddenly a lot more interesting and important when it's put against Origami King.
Yeah.
Not that I'd really want to be on record talking about praising anything of the sort in Mario RPG currently, but it's still worth raising, I think.
And the final point, I think, is the excitement that I see in Nintendo's willingness, and hopefully continuing willingness, to do what we were talking about, but with more niche IP. In that, I mean, even in this generation, we got a reinvention of Fire Emblem and a return to Fire Emblem. We get a return to Famicom Detective Club and a new Famicom Detective Club, and there is the willingness in Nintendo to look for the not obvious answers to things of like where can we diversify our portfolio even into the world of visual novels, which is something that they hadn't cared to work on for 25 years before that. And so I hope my dream beyond dreams is that this energy and this working with new teams and the I think clear drive that they have on a larger library level to satiate all sorts of different genres and even genres within genres. I hope that is also captured by new things, because I think my biggest criticism of the Switch generation is how few new core ideas have been established. Oh my gosh, that was a fat meaty handshake. I think it's possible, but we will see.
Because here's the last point I'll make. We've made a last point like 4 times, but we always do this, so it's fine. You can interpret Echoes of Wisdom as a very safe game.
Sure.
Intriguingly, in my opinion. Because you can just see them say, you can look at that game and say, and it's a little bit reductive, but I think fair to an extent, say, okay, they don't know what to do with 2D Zelda, so they're just doing what they've been doing for the last 10 years almost.
Yeah, definitely. Well, development-wise,
Yeah, in 2D.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. Nintendo always exists in this balance of giving you what you want, and the last 20 or 30% is something different, right? They're safe and familiar, but they have this portion of their titles, and I'm talking about within any individual title, that is new or different or something, right? There's always something. And that's why I think it's complicated. This conversation is just complicated.
Yeah.
Because you can make really good cases for these franchises not being super evolutionary, a lot of them. Metroid, Kirby, whatever.
Yeah.
You can make cases for safeness, experimentation, I think, in equal breath. So, yeah, the bottom line is I think that Echoes of Wisdom looks like an iPad game for children.
Beep bop.